The bullet had torn through Dawson Ryder's thigh muscle clean and deep, and 3 weeks later it still wept blood and pus like a spring that refused to run dry. He stumbled into Empire City, Nevada, on a horse that was barely standing itself, his vision swimming from fever and blood loss, and collapsed in front of the general store before anyone could catch him. Lillian Kane was measuring out flour for Mrs. Henderson when she heard the commotion outside. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the harsh afternoon sunlight of September 1878, squinting against the glare that reflected off the dusty Main Street. A crowd had already gathered around the fallen man, and she could see the dark stain spreading across his torn trousers, the way his skin had gone gray beneath the stubble and trail dirt. "Someone fetch Doc Morrison," she called out, but old Mr. Peters shook his head. "Doc's 3 towns over, tending to that mining accident. Won't be back for a week at least." Lillian knelt beside the stranger, pressing her fingers to his neck. His pulse jumped erratically beneath her touch, fast and weak. She had helped her mother tend wounds before the cholera took her 2 years ago, had learned about infection and fever, about the delicate balance between life and death. This man was tipping toward the wrong side of that balance. "Help me get him to the boarding house," she said firmly. "Mr. Peters, you and your son take his arms. Carefully now." They carried him up the street to the boarding house where Lillian rented 2 rooms on the 2nd floor. Her landlady, Mrs. Cooper, protested at first, but Lillian had already made up her mind. She cleared her own narrow bed and they laid him there, his long legs hanging off the end, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Out all of you," Lillian said, rolling up her sleeves. "I need water, clean water and lots of it, and bandages, any clean cloth you can spare." When they were alone, she cut away his trousers with her sewing scissors, revealing the wound that had been festering beneath makeshift bandages. The entry hole was small, but the exit wound at the back of his thigh was ragged and inflamed, surrounded by angry red skin that felt hot to the touch. She could see where someone had tried to cauterize it, had packed it with something that might have been tobacco or coffee grounds, folk remedies that had done more harm than good. Lillian filled her wash basin with the water misses. Cooper brought up, added a generous splash of whiskey from the bottle she kept for medicinal purposes, and began to clean the wound. The stranger stirred, groaning, his eyes fluttering open for just a moment. They were gray, she noticed, the color of storm clouds over the mountains. "Easy," she murmured. "You are safe now. Just rest." For 3 days he burned with fever. Lillian sponged his forehead with cool water, forced willow bark tea between his cracked lips, changed the dressings on his leg every few hours as the wound continued to seep. She learned the geography of his face during those long nights, the strong line of his jaw, the scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly when it was damp with sweat. She also learned his name from the papers in his saddlebag, which someone had brought up from the stable. Dawson Ryder, 26 years old according to a letter from his sister, dated 6 months earlier. There was a deputy marshal's badge wrapped in a handkerchief, and a tintype photograph of a woman who looked enough like him to be family. No wanted posters, no indication that he was anything other than what the badge suggested. On the 4th morning, his fever broke. Lillian woke slumped in the chair beside the bed, her neck stiff and aching to find those gray eyes watching her with confusion and something that might have been wonder. "Where am I?" His voice came out as a rasp, barely audible. "Empire City, Nevada. My name is Lillian Kane." "You collapsed in front of the general store. Do you remember?" He tried to sit up and immediately fell back with a gasp of pain, his hand going to his wounded thigh. "How long?" 4 days. "Your wound is infected. It has been difficult to stop the bleeding." She stood and stretched, feeling her spine crack. "I need to change your dressing again. Are you hungry? Thirsty? Water," he managed. "Please." She held the cup while he drank, supporting his head with her other hand. His hair was softer than she expected, still damp from the sponge bath she had given him during the night. When he had drunk his fill, she set about unwrapping the bandages on his leg, dreading what she would find. The wound looked worse, if anything. The edges were puffy and inflamed, pulling away from each other despite her careful stitching. Clear fluid mixed with blood soaked through the clean cloth she had packed against it, and the surrounding skin had taken on a mottled appearance that made her stomach clench with worry. "Is it bad?" Dawson asked, his voice tight with pain. Lillian met his eyes and decided on honesty. "It should be healing by now. I have cleaned it thoroughly, used every remedy I know, but it keeps weeping. I am worried about gangrene." "Then maybe you should just let me die and save yourself the trouble." "That is not even remotely funny." She began cleaning the wound again as gently as she could manage. He hissed through his teeth but did not pull away. "How did this happen? Who shot you?" "Bank robbers. I was tracking them through the Ruby Mountains. There were 3 of them, and I was not as careful as I should have been. One of them got off a lucky shot before I could take cover." He paused, breathing hard. "Did I get them? Please tell me I at least got them." "I do not know anything about bank robbers. You arrived here alone." She finished cleaning and reached for fresh bandages. "Were you following them here?" "I do not know where here is exactly. I just rode until I could not ride anymore." He watched her hands as she worked, her slim fingers competent and sure despite the grim nature of the task. "Why are you doing this? Taking care of me, I mean. You do not know me." Lillian paused, considering the question. The answer was not simple. Part of it was the basic human decency her mother had instilled in her, the belief that you help those who needed helping. Part of it was the quiet loneliness that had settled over her life since her mother's death. The empty rooms and empty days that stretched ahead with nothing to fill them. And part of it, though she would not have admitted it then, was something about the man himself, the vulnerability in those storm-gray eyes, the way he had looked at her when he woke as though she were something precious and unexpected. "Because someone had to," she said finally, tying off the bandage. "And because I know what it is like to be alone in a hard place." Over the next week, Lillian fell into a routine. She woke before dawn to change Dawson's dressing, then went downstairs to help Mrs. Cooper with breakfast for the other boarders. After breakfast, she walked to the general store where she worked 6 days a week, measuring dry goods and tallying accounts, and listening to the gossip that flowed through the shop like water. At noon, she hurried back to the boarding house to check on her patient, bringing him lunch and fresh water, cleaning the wound that stubbornly refused to close. In the evening, she brought dinner and stayed longer, talking while he ate, learning the pieces of his story. He had been born in Missouri, the youngest of 4 children. His father had been a farmer until the war came and took him to a battlefield in Tennessee where he died of dysentery before ever firing his rifle. His mother had remarried, and Dawson had left home at 16, unable to get along with his stepfather. He had worked cattle drives, served as a guard for stagecoach lines, eventually pinned on a deputy marshal's badge in Colorado. The work suited him, he said, the combination of solitude and purpose, though he did not mention whether he had ever had anyone to come home to. Lillian told him about her own life in simpler strokes. She had come to Empire City with her mother after her father died in a mining accident in California. They had run a small laundry business together until the cholera epidemic of 1876 took her mother and half the town. She had taken the job at the general store because she needed to eat, and stayed because there was nowhere else to go and no money to get there. "You could remarry," Dawson suggested one evening, and immediately looked like he regretted saying it. "I was never married to begin with," Lillian said, more sharply than she intended. "And I have no interest in becoming some man's unpaid servant just so I can say I have a husband. I would rather manage on my own, thank you. I did not mean to offend you." She sighed and set down the book she had been reading aloud to him. "I am sorry. It is just that everyone in this town seems to think a woman of 23 is practically an old maid, and I have heard quite enough about it. Mrs. Henderson at the store never stops suggesting eligible men, as if I should be grateful for any attention at all. For what it is worth, I think you seem to be managing admirably on your own." Dawson shifted carefully against his pillows, trying not to jar his wounded leg. "Most people would have given up on me by now." "Well, I am not most people." She picked up the book again, a collection of poems she had borrowed from the tiny lending library the church maintained. Now, where were we? But the wound did not improve. If anything, it seemed to grow angrier with each passing day despite Lillian's meticulous care. She tried honey poultices, which her mother had sworn by. She tried a salve made from rendered animal fat and herbs that Mrs. Cooper's mother had used during the Mexican War. She kept the wound scrupulously clean, changed the dressings 3 and sometimes 4 times a day, and still it wept and bled, the edges refusing to knit together. Dawson grew frustrated and restless, trapped in the narrow bed while his body refused to heal. He was accustomed to constant movement, to action and purpose, and the forced stillness made him irritable. More than once Lillian found him trying to stand on his own, only to collapse back onto the bed with a curse when his leg refused to support his weight. "You are going to tear it open worse," she scolded after one such attempt, examining the fresh blood that had soaked through his bandages. "If you cannot be sensible about your own recovery, at least think about all the work I am putting in to keep you alive." "I am thinking about it," he snapped back. "I am thinking about what a burden I am, lying here useless while you work yourself ragged taking care of me. I am thinking about how you are spending your own money on bandages and medicine when you can barely afford to feed yourself. I am thinking about what a fool I was to get shot in the first place." Lillian set down her supplies and looked at him directly. His face was drawn with pain and frustration, his jaw tight, and she could see the shame in his eyes, the way it ate at him to be dependent on her charity. "You listen to me, Dawson Ryder," she said quietly but firmly. "You are not a burden. You are a person who needs help, and I am choosing to give it. I do not want your guilt or your apologies. I want you to rest and let your body heal, which it cannot do if you keep trying to walk on a leg that is not ready to bear weight. Do you understand me?" He stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "Why do you care so much?" The question hung in the air between them. Lillian could feel her heart beating faster, could feel the weight of truth pressing against her ribs. Because somewhere in the past 2 weeks, between the fever dreams and the quiet conversations, between the intimate act of caring for his broken body, and the way he looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world, she had started to care about him in a way that went beyond simple compassion. "Because you matter," she said instead, which was true enough, even if it was not the whole truth. "Now lie still and let me finish this." Doc Morrison returned to Empire City on a Wednesday afternoon, his wagon rattling down the main street with its distinctive squeak that announced his presence. Lillian was at the store when she heard it, and she immediately abandoned her post to intercept him before he could disappear into his office. "Miss Kane," he greeted her, climbing down stiffly from the wagon seat. He was a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and perpetually ink-stained fingers. "I heard you have been playing nurse in my absence. Mrs. Cooper told me all about your patient." I need you to look at his wound. It is not healing properly. It has been almost 3 weeks now, and no matter what I do, it keeps bleeding and weeping. I am afraid I am missing something, that there is something I should be doing differently. Doc Morrison collected his bag and followed her back to the boarding house, up the narrow stairs to her rooms where Dawson waited. The deputy marshal looked better than he had in the early days, the fever flush gone from his cheeks, but he was still far too pale, and the shadows under his eyes spoke to sleepless nights and constant pain. The doctor's examination was thorough and careful. He unwrapped Lillian's neat bandages, probed the wound with gentle fingers, asked questions about fever and drainage and pain levels. Finally, he sat back with a thoughtful expression. "Miss Kane, your care has been exemplary. I could not have done better myself with the resources available. The wound is clean. There is no sign of gangrene or deep infection. The problem, I think, is that the bullet tore through the muscle at an angle, severing several major blood vessels. They are trying to heal, but every time the leg moves or bears weight, they tear open again. So what do we do?" Dawson asked, his voice rough with worry. "Complete rest. I mean complete, Mr. Ryder. No standing, no walking, not even sitting up more than necessary. You need to stay flat on your back and let those vessels have time to knit together properly. It could take weeks, possibly months. And Miss Kane, you need to continue exactly what you have been doing. Keep it clean, keep it bandaged, watch for any signs of infection. Beyond that, all we can do is wait and hope his body does the rest." After the doctor left, Lillian prepared a fresh dressing in silence. She could feel Dawson's frustration radiating from him like heat from a stove, could see the way his hands clenched and unclenched on the quilt. "Months," he said finally, the word bitter. "I cannot stay here for months, Lillian. I cannot keep imposing on your kindness, taking up your bed, eating your food, monopolizing your time. It is not right. Where else would you go? Back out on the trail? You would die before you made it 10 miles. She began unwinding the soiled bandages, her movements practiced and efficient. "And this is my choice, Dawson. My bed, my food, my time. I am not some helpless victim of your imposition. I am a grown woman making my own decisions." "But why? You still have not really answered that question. Why would you sacrifice so much for a stranger?" Lillian finished cleaning the wound before she answered, taking her time with the fresh bandages, tucking the ends in just so. When she finally met his eyes, she felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening that she had not known was closed. "You are not a stranger anymore," she said simply. "Not to me." The days stretched into weeks, and autumn settled over Empire City with its cooler temperatures and golden light. Lillian continued her daily routine of work and care, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Dawson began to improve. The wound still wept and bled, but less each day. The angry redness around the edges faded to pink, then to the pale color of new skin. He started sitting up for longer periods, started showing interest in the books she brought him, started asking questions about her life and the town and the future. They played cards in the evenings, using matches as betting chips, and Lillian discovered that he was a terrible bluffer. They read aloud to each other, trading off when one of their voices grew tired. She brought him the weekly newspaper from Virginia City, and he read her the news from the wider world, the politics and scandals and small triumphs that seemed both very important and very far away. Mrs. Cooper had stopped charging Lillian rent, declaring that anyone who would take such good care of a wounded stranger deserved a little charity of her own. Some of the other townspeople brought food, an extra loaf of bread, or a pot of stew, small kindnesses that eased the financial burden. Mr. Henderson at the general store gave her a raise, praising her dedication and work ethic. though she suspected he had heard about her situation and was trying to help without making it obvious. Through it all, Lillian tended Dawson's wound with a devotion that bordered on religious. Every morning and evening, sometimes more often if the bandages needed changing, she cleaned and dressed the injury that was slowly, finally, beginning to heal. Her hands learned the landscape of his thigh as intimately as she knew her own face. Every ridge of muscle, every scar and freckle, the particular way the skin dimpled near his knee. There was something deeply intimate about the act, beyond the obvious physical closeness. He trusted her with his vulnerability, with his pain and frustration and fear. She trusted him with her time and attention, with the small hopes and dreams she had kept locked away since her mother's death. In the quiet of those early mornings and late evenings, with the lamp burning low and the rest of the house asleep, they built something between them that felt both fragile and enduring. "I think I am falling in love with you," Dawson said one night in late October, the words dropping into the silence like stones into still water. Lillian's hands stilled on the bandage she was wrapping. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. She had known, of course, had felt it growing between them like a seedling reaching toward sunlight, but hearing him say it aloud made it real in a way that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "You do not have to say anything," he continued quickly. "I know this is not an ideal situation. I know I am in no position to court you properly, to offer you anything resembling a normal future. But I needed you to know. I needed to tell you that you are the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before I sleep. That your kindness has meant more to me than I know how to express. That if I could choose anywhere in the world to be, wounded leg and all, I would choose right here, with you." Lillian finished tying off the bandage with trembling fingers. When she looked up, his gray eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I think I have been for a while now. I was just afraid to admit it, even to myself." He reached out and caught her hand, threading his fingers through hers. His palm was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked with guns and horses, but his touch was gentle. "What do we do now?" "I suppose we keep going," she said, allowing herself to smile. "We let your leg heal. We see where this takes us. We stop being afraid of what might happen and start appreciating what is happening." He tugged her closer, and she went willingly, perching on the edge of the bed beside him. When he kissed her, it was soft and questioning, a promise rather than a demand. She kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside, all the loneliness and longing and desperate hope that tomorrow might be better than today. "I am going to marry you," he said when they finally broke apart, his forehead resting against hers. "When I can stand on my own 2 feet again, when I can offer you a proper home and a proper future, I am going to marry you, Lillian Kane, if you will have me." "I will have you," she said, laughing through the tears that had sprung to her eyes. "Wounded leg and all, I will absolutely have you." The wound began to heal in earnest after that, as though Dawson's body had finally decided it had permission to get better. The bleeding slowed and stopped. The edges of the torn flesh began to knit together, new pink skin growing across the gap. Lillian continued her careful tending, but now there was joy in it, anticipation rather than dread each time she unwrapped the bandages. By mid-November, Dawson was able to stand with assistance, leaning heavily on Lillian's shoulder as he took a few tentative steps around the room. His legs shook with the effort, muscles weakened from weeks of disuse, but it held his weight. The wound pulled and ached, but it did not tear open, did not start bleeding again. "It is working," he said, wonder in his voice. "It is actually working." "Of course it is working," Lillian said, though her own relief was palpable. "I told you it would heal if you gave it time." They practiced walking every day, building his strength slowly and carefully. Within a week, he could make it across the room without support. Within 2 weeks, he was walking up and down the stairs, one hand on the banister for balance but his own legs doing the work. The wound was now just a puckered pink scar, tender but closed, no longer weeping or bleeding no matter how much he moved. Doc Morrison pronounced himself satisfied when he came to check on his patient in early December. "I have seen men lose legs for less severe wounds," he told them, shaking his head in amazement. "You did good work, Miss Kane. Exceptional work. You saved his leg and probably his life." "She saved more than that," Dawson said, catching Lillian's hand. "She saved everything." With Dawson's recovery came decisions that needed to be made. He sent a telegram to his superiors in Colorado, explaining his absence and his injury. They replied with instructions to finish his recuperation, and then report to the marshal's office in Carson City, where they would discuss his next assignment. He also wrote to his sister, the one whose letter Lillian had found in his saddlebag, telling her about his injury and about the woman who had cared for him. Lillian wrote no letters because there was no one to write to, but she made plans of her own. She gave notice at the general store, thanked Mrs. Cooper for her kindness, and began packing up the few possessions she had accumulated in her 2 years in Empire City. When Dawson asked where she thought she was going, she looked at him like he was simple. "With you, of course." "Unless you were not serious about that proposal." "I was completely serious. But Lillian, are you sure? You would be leaving behind everything you know, following a man whose job takes him all over the territory. It will not be an easy life. Staying here would not be an easy life either. At least with you, I will have someone to share the difficulties with." She folded a dress carefully and laid it in her trunk. "Besides, you are not getting rid of me that easily. Someone needs to make sure you do not get shot again." They were married on a cold morning in mid-December by the circuit preacher who came through Empire City once a month. Mrs. Cooper and Doc Morrison stood as witnesses, and half the town turned out to watch, curious about the romance that had blossomed in their midst. Lillian wore her best dress, a deep blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and carried a small bouquet of dried flowers that Mrs. Cooper had saved from her summer garden. Dawson stood tall beside her, his legs strong enough now to hold him through the ceremony without wavering. He had shaved and cut his hair, borrowed a proper suit from the banker, and when he spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, he kissed her with such tenderness that several of the watching women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. They left Empire City 2 days later on a stage headed north toward Carson City. Lillian watched the little town disappear behind them with mixed feelings. It had been her home for 2 years, the place where she had buried her mother and learned to stand on her own. But it had never felt like more than a way station, a temporary stopping point on a journey she had not known she was taking. Now, with her hand clasped in Dawson's, and her future spreading out before her like an unwritten page, she felt the first stirrings of real hope. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Carson City was larger and busier than Empire City, with proper brick buildings and paved streets, and a sense of permanence that the mining towns lacked. The marshal's office was housed in the courthouse, an imposing 2-story structure that made Lillian feel small and uncertain as they climbed the steps. The chief marshal was a heavy-set man named Thompson, who greeted Dawson like a wayward son, gripping his hand and clapping him on the shoulder. "Ryder, we thought we had lost you. When you did not report in after tracking those bank robbers, we feared the worst." "I nearly gave you reason to," Dawson said. "If not for my wife, I would not be standing here." Marshal Thompson turned his attention to Lillian, his expression softening. "Madam, the territory owes you a debt of gratitude. Dawson is one of our best men." They discussed Dawson's next assignment over coffee in Thompson's office. The wound had healed well, but it would never be quite the same. Dawson would always have a slight limp, would need to be careful not to strain the damaged muscles. Thompson suggested a position that involved less riding and more investigative work, based out of Carson City, rather than constantly on the trail. "We need someone to coordinate between the local sheriffs and the federal marshals," Thompson explained. "Someone with field experience who understands how the work gets done. It would mean a lot of paperwork and politics, but it would also mean a steady salary and a permanent home. Given your circumstances, I thought it might appeal." Dawson glanced at Lillian, who nodded slightly. "I think that sounds perfect," he said. They rented a small house on the edge of town, 2 rooms and a kitchen with a yard big enough for a garden. It was not much, but it was theirs, the first real home either of them had known in years. Lillian hung curtains in the windows and planted herbs by the back door. Dawson built a bookshelf and filled it with the novels and poetry collections they had read together during his recovery. In the evenings, after Dawson came home from the marshal's office and Lillian finished her work, for she had taken a job keeping accounts for a local merchant, they would sit together on the porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains. Sometimes they talked about their days, the small triumphs and frustrations of ordinary life. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, content just to be together. On cold nights, Lillian would trace the scar on Dawson's thigh with gentle fingers, remembering the wound that had brought them together. It was pale now, barely visible in the lamplight, but she could still feel the ridge of damaged tissue, the place where his body had refused to heal until she convinced it otherwise through sheer, stubborn devotion. "Does it hurt?" she would ask, though she knew the answer. "Sometimes," he would admit, "when the weather changes or I have been on my feet too long, but it is worth it. Every twinge reminds me of how lucky I am. Lucky to have been shot, lucky that you found me, lucky that you cared enough to save me. Lucky that I get to spend the rest of my life with you." Their first winter together was cold and quiet, a time of settling in and learning each other's rhythms. Dawson proved to be an early riser who liked his coffee strong and his breakfast hearty. Lillian was more of a night owl, staying up late to read by lamplight, though she learned to adjust her schedule to match his. They divided the household chores with pragmatic efficiency, cooking and cleaning and maintaining their small home together. In February, Dawson's sister Sarah arrived for a visit, traveling by train from Colorado with her husband and 2 young children. She embraced Lillian like a long-lost friend, thanking her over and over for saving her brother's life. "I was so worried when I got his letter," Sarah confided one afternoon while the men were out and the children napped. "Dawson has always been so independent, so determined to handle everything himself. I could not imagine him letting anyone take care of him, let alone falling in love in the process." "I think the circumstances did not give him much choice," Lillian said, pouring tea. "He was too sick to argue, at least at first. And later, when he was well enough to be stubborn." Lillian smiled, remembering those long weeks of careful tending, of slowly building trust and affection. "Later, I think he realized that sometimes letting someone help you is not a weakness, that there is strength in vulnerability, in admitting you need someone." "You are good for him," Sarah said warmly. "I can see it in his face, the way he looks at you. He is happy, truly happy, in a way I have not seen since before our father died. You have given him something to come home to, something to live for beyond the next arrest or the next gunfight." The words stayed with Lillian long after Sarah and her family returned to Colorado. She had never thought of herself as particularly important or necessary to anyone. After her mother died, she had been alone in the world, connected to nothing and no one. But now she was the center of Dawson's life, and he of hers, and there was profound comfort in that mutual dependence. Spring came late to Nevada that year, arriving in fits and starts, warm days followed by late snowfalls. Lillian planted a proper garden in the yard, vegetables and flowers mixed together in cheerful profusion. She discovered she had a talent for growing things, a patience and attention to detail that served her as well with plants as it had with Dawson's stubborn wound. Dawson threw himself into his work at the marshal's office, coordinating investigations and tracking criminals across the territory. He was good at the job, his field experience giving him insights that the more bureaucratic marshals lacked. Marshal Thompson praised his reports and relied on his judgment, and gradually gave him more responsibility. But no matter how busy his days were, Dawson always came home in the evenings. He never took assignments that would keep him away overnight, never volunteered for the dangerous tracking jobs that had once been his specialty. He had learned, he told Lillian, that there were different kinds of bravery, that sometimes the courageous choice was to stay rather than to go. In May, Lillian realized she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, a missed monthly cycle followed by morning nausea and a new tenderness in her breasts. She waited until she was certain before telling Dawson, wanting to be sure before she raised his hopes. She chose a quiet evening when they were sitting on the porch, the air soft with the scent of her blooming flowers. "I have something to tell you," she began, suddenly nervous despite all the months of intimacy and trust between them. He turned to look at her, immediately alert to the change in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine. Better than fine, actually. I am pregnant, Dawson. We are going to have a baby." The expression that crossed his face was pure joy, unguarded and radiant. He pulled her into his arms, careful even in his excitement, and buried his face in her hair. "A baby," he murmured. "We are going to have a baby. Lillian, that is wonderful. That is the best news I have ever heard. You are not worried. We have only been married 6 months. Our house is small. Money is not exactly plentiful. I do not care about any of that. We will manage the same way we have managed everything else, together." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining. "When? I think in January, if my calculations are right. A New Year baby." They told Marshal Thompson the next day, and he immediately increased Dawson's salary, citing the new responsibility of a growing family. They told Mrs. Cooper and Doc Morrison by letter, and received warm congratulations in return. Sarah sent a package of baby clothes her own children had outgrown, along with a letter full of advice and encouragement. As summer heated the valley and Lillian's belly began to swell, they made preparations. Dawson built a cradle from plans he found in a magazine, sanding the wood smooth so there would be no splinters to catch tiny fingers. Lillian sewed tiny gowns and blankets, her hands busy in the evenings while Dawson read aloud from the newspaper. They discussed names endlessly, unable to decide, changing their minds every few days. Lillian felt well throughout the pregnancy, suffering nothing worse than occasional tiredness and a persistent craving for oranges that Dawson indulged whenever he could find them. Her body changed gradually, her waist thickening, her breasts growing heavy, her face taking on a luminous quality that Dawson swore made her more beautiful than ever. In the early mornings, before the heat of the day, they would walk together through the neighborhood, Lillian's hand resting on Dawson's arm for support. His limp was more pronounced when he first woke, the old wound stiff until he had moved around for a while, but he never complained. Sometimes Lillian would glance down at his leg, thinking about those desperate weeks when she had feared he might lose it, might die, and she would squeeze his arm a little tighter, grateful beyond words for his solid presence beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked one such morning, catching her expression. "That I am glad you rode into Empire City when you did, that I am glad I was there to help you, that everything we have now, everything we are building together, it all started with that bullet wound and my stubborn refusal to let you die." He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I think about that too, about how I could have ridden to any town, could have collapsed in front of any building, but some piece of luck or fate or divine intervention brought me to you. And you could have turned away, could have let someone else deal with the burden of a dying stranger, but you did not. You chose to care, and that choice changed both our lives." "I would choose it again," Lillian said softly. "1,000 times over I would choose you." He kissed her there in the street, in the soft light of dawn, with the whole town sleeping around them. And in that moment, with his child growing inside her and their future spreading out like the wide Nevada sky, Lillian felt a happiness so complete it almost frightened her with its intensity. Autumn arrived with cooler temperatures and golden leaves in the trees that lined their street. Lillian grew larger and more ungainly, her body preparing for the work ahead. Doc Morrison had agreed to attend the birth, and he stopped by regularly to check on her progress, pronouncing himself satisfied each time. "You are healthy and strong," he told her during one such visit in late November. "Your body knows what to do, trust it, and trust yourself." "I trust Dawson," Lillian said, glancing at her husband who hovered nearby looking anxious. "He will keep me grounded when the fear becomes too much." The baby came on a cold January night, 3 weeks earlier than they had expected. Lillian woke to cramping pains that quickly intensified into full labor. Dawson sent for Doc Morrison and then stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement when the pain grew so intense she thought she might break. "You can do this," he said over and over. "You are the strongest person I know. You saved my life when no one else could have. You can do anything." And she did. After hours of hard work that left her exhausted and trembling, their son was born just as dawn was breaking. He came into the world squalling and red-faced, perfect in every way. Doc Morrison placed him on Lillian's chest while Dawson cut the cord with shaking hands, his face wet with tears. "We have a son," Dawson whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "Lillian, we have a son." They named him Daniel, after Lillian's father, with Robert as his middle name for Dawson's father. He was a good baby, as such things were measured, crying only when hungry or wet, sleeping in long stretches that allowed his exhausted parents to rest. Lillian took to motherhood with the same competence she had brought to nursing Dawson's wound, learning the baby's needs and rhythms, adapting to the demands of caring for a helpless infant. But it was harder than she had expected, the constant vigilance, the bone-deep exhaustion, the way her own needs always came last. Dawson helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Daniel when he fussed in the evenings, changing nappies without complaint, taking over the cooking and cleaning when Lillian was too tired to manage. He had requested leave from the marshal's office for 2 weeks after the birth, and he used that time to support his wife in every way he could think of. "I could not have done this without you," Lillian told him one night when Daniel was finally asleep and they had collapsed into bed, too tired to do more than hold each other. "You could have," Dawson said, "but I am glad you did not have to. You have spent so much time taking care of me, taking care of everyone. Let me take care of you for a change." The years that followed were full and busy, marked by the ordinary joys and struggles of family life. Daniel grew from infant to toddler to small boy, sturdy and curious and full of questions about everything. Lillian went back to her accounting work part-time, keeping the books for several local businesses from home so she could stay with Daniel. Dawson continued at the marshal's office, gradually rising in rank and responsibility. They bought a larger house when Daniel was 3, a proper family home with a separate bedroom for their son and a bigger yard for him to play in. They planted fruit trees and built a chicken coop, moving toward a kind of self-sufficiency that appealed to both of them. Life was not always easy. Money was sometimes tight and worry was never far away, but they faced every challenge together. When Daniel was 5, Lillian found herself pregnant again. This time she was less anxious, more confident in her body's ability to do what needed doing. Their daughter Emma was born on a warm May evening, smaller than Daniel had been but equally healthy. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determination, and from the very beginning she knew exactly what she wanted. Dawson was besotted with both his children, playing with them on the floor in the evenings, reading them stories, teaching them to ride and rope, and all the skills he had learned growing up. But he also taught them gentleness and compassion, the lessons he had learned lying wounded in a boarding house bed while a young woman refused to give up on him. "Your mother saved my life," he told them when they were old enough to understand. "When I was hurt and sick and everyone else would have given up, she cleaned my wound every single day until it finally healed. She showed me what real strength looks like, what real love means. And that is why I want you to remember that the strongest people are not always the ones with the biggest guns or the toughest reputations. Sometimes they are the ones who keep showing up, keep trying, keep caring even when it seems hopeless." On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the house was still, Lillian and Dawson would sit together as they had from the very beginning, talking or reading or simply being together. Dawson's leg still bothered him sometimes, especially in cold weather, and Lillian would massage the old scar with liniment, her hands as careful and gentle as they had been during those desperate weeks of healing. "Does it still hurt?" she always asked, the ritual unchanged after all these years. "Not much," he would say. "And even when it does, I do not mind. Every twinge is a reminder of how we started, of everything we have built together." As the children grew older, Lillian told them the full story of how she and their father met. She described Empire City and the boarding house, the terrible wound that would not heal, the weeks of patient tending that had slowly, gradually, impossibly worked. She wanted them to understand that love was not always romantic gestures and passionate declarations. Sometimes it was cleaning a wound every morning and evening. Sometimes it was refusing to give up even when giving up seemed like the reasonable choice. "That is what marriage is," she told Emma when her daughter was old enough to be curious about such things. "It is tending each other's wounds, the visible ones and the invisible ones. It is showing up every day, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. It is choosing each other over and over again." Daniel followed his father into law enforcement, though he chose to become a local sheriff rather than a federal marshal. Emma became a teacher, working with the children of miners and ranchers in the rough Nevada towns that were still being carved out of the wilderness. Both of them married, brought grandchildren to visit, built their own lives that reflected the values their parents had modeled. Dawson retired from the marshal's office when he was 50, his leg finally unable to handle even the limited physical demands of his desk job. He took up woodworking instead, building furniture that he sold to supplement their savings. His pieces became known throughout the territory for their quality and craftsmanship, sturdy chairs and tables that would last for generations. Lillian continued keeping books until her eyes grew too weak for the close work. After that, she focused on her garden, which had grown over the years to take up most of their property. She supplied vegetables to half the neighborhood and flowers to the church, her hands always busy with growing things. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love as strong as ever. Dawson's limp grew more pronounced, and sometimes on bad days he needed a cane to walk. Lillian developed arthritis in her hands, the same hands that had so carefully tended his wound all those years ago. But they adapted, helping each other with the tasks that became difficult, finding new ways to show love as the old ways became harder. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Dawson gave Lillian a photograph he had commissioned from a traveling photographer. It showed the two of them standing in front of their house, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling at the camera. But what made it special was the inscription he had written on the back in his careful handwriting. To Lillian, who saved my life and gave me a reason to live it. With all my love forever, Dawson. I wanted you to have something that would last, he explained when she cried over it, so that even after I am gone you will remember how much you meant to me, how much you still mean to me. You are not going anywhere, Lillian said fiercely, clutching the photograph. We still have years ahead of us. I am not done taking care of you yet. And she was right. They had another 15 years together. Years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, with quiet evenings on the porch and early morning walks through the neighborhood. Dawson's leg never did fully heal, not really, but it carried him through those years without failing, supported by his own determination and Lillian's long-ago dedication. When Dawson finally died at the age of 71, it was peacefully in his sleep with Lillian beside him. She mourned him deeply, feeling his absence like a physical wound, but she also knew a profound gratitude for the life they had shared. He had been her great love, the partner of her heart, the reward for that one moment of compassion when she chose to help a dying stranger instead of walking away. Lillian lived another 5 years after Dawson's death, surrounded by family, still tending her garden, still telling the story of the wound that would not heal and the stubborn woman who refused to let it kill him. When she died, she was buried beside him in the Carson City Cemetery, under a shared headstone that read simply, Dawson and Lillian Ryder, together in life and in death. Their children and grandchildren gathered around the grave, remembering the stories they had been told, the lessons they had learned. Daniel spoke about his father's strength and his mother's devotion. Emma read from the book of poems her parents had loved, the same book Lillian had read aloud during those long weeks of nursing. And as the sun set over the Nevada mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they all felt the presence of a love that had started with a bullet wound and a kind heart, and had grown into something that would last far beyond one lifetime. The story of Dawson and Lillian became a kind of legend in their family, passed down through the generations. Great-grandchildren who never met them still heard about the deputy marshal who nearly died, and the young woman who saved him through sheer, stubborn dedication. They heard about the wound that would not close, about the daily cleanings that finally convinced it to heal, about the love that grew from that most unlikely beginning. And when those great-grandchildren faced their own challenges, their own moments of despair when giving up seemed easier than going on, they remembered the story. They remembered that sometimes healing takes longer than we expect, that sometimes love requires patience and faith, and showing up every single day, even when there is no guarantee of success. They remembered that the strongest bonds are forged in the moments when we choose to care for each other, to tend each other's wounds, to refuse to give up no matter how hopeless things seem. In the end, that was the real legacy of Dawson and Lillian Ryder. Not the children they raised or the work they did or the years they lived, but the simple truth they proved through their lives together. That love is not a feeling but a choice, made over and over again, day after day, in ways both large and small. That sometimes the most profound acts of courage are the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones that happen in the privacy of a small room with no witnesses, except the two people involved. That healing, whether of body or heart or soul, is almost always a result of someone caring enough to try, and trying again until finally, impossibly, miraculously, the wound closes and new life can begin.